Hello, hello, welcome. Happy Austin Startup Week. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the first official university track of Austin Startup Week. We're so excited here at UT and at McCombs to be a part of it all. I just want to take a second to introduce our moderator, and the panel is just filled with such incredible people, so you're going to hear some amazing things today. Dr. Lewis Martins is a professor and department chair of management here at McCombs. He also serves as the faculty director of the MS in Technology Commercialization program. Prior to joining UT, he was on the faculty of the College of Management at the Georgia Institute of Technology and the School of Business at the University of Connecticut. He earned his PhD in Management and Organizational Behavior from the Stern School of Business at NYU. He conducts research and consults on issues related to innovation, change, and performance. His consultancy and executive development clients include Accenture, AT&T, BBVA, Coca-Cola, FBI Crime Labs, NASA, Rackspace, Waffle House, and a few more after that. So without further ado, Dr. Lewis Martins.
Thank you. Actually, let's applaud for them, but first I'll tell you how cool they are. First, welcome to our session on diversity in the entrepreneurial community. We are fortunate to have the perspectives of 4 people who've spent a lot of time thinking about this and working on this. I'll introduce from your right toward me here. I'll start with Blanca Lesmes. She's a president and co-founder of BB Imaging and has been the CEO at ConfirmX for 18 months now. She met her founder at Div Inc., which I'll talk about in a second, and is charged with operations and strategy at ConfirmX. She graduated in 2001 from the Executive MBA program at UT Austin, and she was my student. One of my favorite students. So, we'll talk a little bit more about the organizations in a second. I just want to introduce them personally. Preston James is Div Inc.'s co-founder and CEO. Prior to that, he is a 20-year veteran from Dell, where he served in executive leadership roles in enterprise IT, technology sales consulting, where he oversaw teams responsible for driving mere 250 million plus in revenues. Small numbers. Impressive. He earned his Bachelor's of Science and Engineering at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and has lived in Austin since 1997. He also was entrepreneur in residence for the Herb Kelleher Center for Entrepreneurship, Growth, and Renewal, which I'm the director of. And it was great working with him, and nice to have a partnership since. Christine Meharry is the founder of Impact DEI, or is it Impact Day?
I know, it's DEI.
Impact
Diversity,
DEI.
Equity, and Inclusion.
Prior to that, she founded and led Retail Me Not's Diversity and Inclusion program. Under her leadership, the program was recognized by Glassdoor as #1 and Built in Austin as #2. She holds a law degree from the University of Virginia and a bachelor's degree from James Madison University.
I love Howard University. Yeah, I'm from DC. Yeah.
And we have Charlie Jackson. He's a serial entrepreneur who has led multiple ventures and projects in software, internet, mobile, and social networking for global 100 companies, including IBM, Apple, Dell, and Philips, so small companies, after an early career in economic development and small business startups. He holds a BA in government and an MSTC from the University of Texas and has been an active part of the Austin startup community for 2 decades. A big hand for them, please. Yeah. So when compiling this panel, we wanted to get a sense for the role that the ecosystem plays in fostering diversity in the entrepreneurial community. Essentially, the idea is there's a tremendous opportunity in terms of increasing the surface area for entrepreneurship by greater diversity and inclusion among the entrepreneurial community. So I have a certain set of questions, and then we'll open it up for general questions and comments. I'd like to start by talking more broadly about diversity within the ecosystem, and would then turn to advice that you have for student founders and other entrepreneurs who are underrepresented in that ecosystem. So let's start with the term diversity. It's a very broad term. Randomly, I happen to study both entrepreneurship and diversity in my research, so it's been fascinating for me to experience this side of it in terms of fostering it. But it's a very broad term and often means different things to different people. How do you each define diversity, and what's your assessment of the level of diversity within the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Austin? And how would you assess the macro challenge of needing more diversity in that ecosystem? Let's start with Blanca.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us out here. I would define diversity as variety and wanting variety of thought and being willing to include a variety of thought brought on by different people. I think that's how I would generally describe it.
From the diversity, I would tend to agree from the definition of just being able to identify different groups and be able to respect the differences in those groups, be it age, be it gender, color of one's skin, nationality, or whatever, and then be able to respect those differences. And I think when we talk about that definition, we also have to be mindful that we should be talking about equity and inclusion as well, right? Because they all, it's for some people it's making the issue more complex, but they all go hand in hand, and so that kind of leads right into
Hello.
DE&I, right?
First of all, I see quite a few people who are practitioners in this space or adjacent to this space. So will you raise your hands, because there's people in here, including some newcomers to our area who are in this space. So thank you for being here. I would define diversity as race, ethnicity, age, sexual identity or preference, religion, class, ability. I think class and ability get skipped a lot, and cognitive diversity, which is diversity of perspective. And I think too often right now, cognitive diversity to some extent is trumping race and other issues that aren't coming enough to the forefront. So my generation, which is, I'm a recovering lawyer and a baby boomer, tends to look at the legal definitions, because I did look at it that way. I see Manjula too. There are a lot of people in this space right now who are practitioners. But I think we need to always keep in mind that as the euphemisms or definition of diversity expands and contracts, that we also keep in mind the serious systemic equity issues we have, and so that we can ultimately create a space of belonging and inclusion.
So I following everybody else here, I certainly see the broad spectrum of diversity, but I look at it a lot from the economic standpoint. I grew up as a child in East Austin, very ethnically diverse part of town, but the opportunities in Austin were not diverse. They were a lot better for my father and for me than they were for my friends and neighbors that I grew up around. And being in high tech for the last 25 years here in Austin, what I've seen is we've got a very strong entrepreneurial ecosystem, but it's left behind at least 50% of the people who were born or raised or moved to Austin. And so that's the challenge that I'm working on. Not that that's the definition of diversity, but basically making sure that everybody is included.
I think when we talk about the Austin ecosystem, even a few years ago, Preston founded Div Inc., which is a diversity incubator here in Austin. So any underrepresented community member could apply to their accelerator program. And I was a mentor at that point when he first started, and I remember going to the pitch day, the day that all of the startups get to actually present their idea. And I remember thinking, I have never seen this many people of other in one space in Austin. I just had never experienced it. And that was, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And since then, that pitch day, or the demo day, has really grown to a standing room only, busting at the seams. And you're seeing this really extraordinary ecosystem really grow around this issue. So I think that's interesting, because that was in the same year that Capital Factory had an all-male white cohort, and Div Inc. had this as kind of, I don't want to say it was a response to it, because I don't know that, but I'm just saying it was very interesting that it coincided with the founding of Div Inc., that you could have this this other represented in this way.
I could. When as you talk about that, and I think we'll get more into this, is the, out of the culture of Div Inc., and I think that's really what we were able to do very successfully, is to establish a culture, not just, bring people of color together, but we established a culture, and that culture in itself began to expand within the community. And, and more of us feel comfortable engaging with one another in this space. And it's inclusive of everyone, right? It's not saying, oh, white men can't come. Absolutely not, right? It's everyone, and I think that's what we continue to see, not just in Demo Day, but the mentors and the investors and the entrepreneurs and people who have subject matter expertise. They're all coming together to say, hey, this is how we can make the startup ecosystem so much more vibrant by being more inclusive of a broader spectrum of people. And I think people are taking notice of that, and I think people really deep down, a lot of people want that. And so we begin to work together to make that happen.
Great. I'll pick up on that. There are many arguments for why we need more diversity within the entrepreneur community. Personally, for your own selves, what do you find to be the most compelling reason for fostering such diversity? And I'll start with Christine. And
there is no, in my mind, there is no distinction between the team member and the consumer. So your customer experience and your team member experience are inextricably linked. And if you don't understand your customer base and recognize the shifting demographics, and I know that we're going to talk about trends in a minute, and you're not hiring at the outset with that in mind, then you're already behind the curve. And what I find frustrating, and I'm working on this in terms of ecosystem building, is that too many venture capitalists are giving their HR folks one-off trainings around what they think is diversity and inclusion, like a one-off unconscious bias training. And then those people turn around and are counseling founders who are very heads down. And when they're looking for software engineers, it takes a lot more than a one-off training from a recently trained HR person in venture capital world. So we really need to start in many different places to build ecosystem. But you really always need to think about whatever product or service you're offering to the public, whatever problem you're solving at scale, your team members need to reflect your demographics so that you are creating products and services that are truly going to serve them and not in some ways inadvertently alienate them. We're all looking at you.
Okay. So I was very fortunate. My mother's very strong feminist, and so I was brought up in that tradition. And throughout my career, I've worked with many women leaders and bosses and CEO. So that's really where I started. And then I was a geek, so there was always the tradition or the issue of fitting in if you're a geek. And then when I came to college at UT, I discovered I was gay as well. So there was that angle of fitting into the business and the startup community. But I always carried with me, my roots in East Austin, and my frustration with seeing so many talented people with their own dreams and desires and passions not finding anywhere where they could exercise those kinds of things. Even though we've got a very good entrepreneurial ecosystem, they weren't brought in, they weren't included, they weren't provided the opportunities to be a part of it.
Yeah, so spending 20 years at Dow, I was a long time corporate guy, so a lot of things that you mentioned about the hiring and retention of diverse candidates, and it's the right thing to do from the business. And then coming over to the entrepreneurship side, I think it's important to have this diversity looking down the line from the economic growth and prosperity perspective. So if you think about it, entrepreneurship is really the key engine to economic growth in society, right? And so I don't know if you guys know this, but according to Kauffman Foundation, entrepreneurship has been in decline for a good while, 2006 or whatever the time period. So it's been in a decline for a while. And so in order to help grow our entrepreneurship, which is the key engine of our economic growth in the U.S., we've got to get more folks involved in that entrepreneurship side. And not only that, we need to get more folks involved in the startup innovation. Now, I didn't say tech startup, I said startup innovation, because innovation can come from anywhere, right? Regardless of what school you went to, regardless of what zip code you live in, regardless, innovation can come from anywhere. So a statistic that hit me not too long ago, which was done by a VC. He's an African-American VC, one of the few. And based on his research, 80% of venture capitalists are men, okay? And 70% of those are white men, right? And then if you look at, so the Asian number of VCs has gone up a little bit, women has gone up a little bit, which is great. But women account for over 50% of the population in the United States, yet they only get 3% of the venture capital, right? African Americans get 1%, and they're 13% of the population, right? So what it's saying to me is that, hey, we've got some serious biases going on in the entrepreneurship community, whether it's intentional or unintentional, right? There's bias there, and we are, as an economy, we are ignoring a good portion of our population. From a business perspective, that makes absolutely no sense. If you're an investor, why would you seal yourself off from the other half of the population, right? Another stunning statistic came out, the same guy, 40% of all the venture capitalists came from two schools.
It's
Yes.
Stanford, and what's the other one?
Not
I got your draw right here. Hey, here we go.
Harvard and
You guys know
Stanford?
which two they are?
I think it's Yale.
Say it again. Harvard and Stanford. And I'm like, wait a minute, UT is pretty badass. We need to get our number up there, right?
Too late.
Texas as a state is pretty badass too, right? So, there's this opportunity out there to tap in to a larger portion of the population, a larger portion of the talent that is out there, and allow that to increase our job creation, wealth creation, right? Innovation. And we're missing out on that opportunity today. But going forward tomorrow, if we don't take advantage of it, then we have to really be concerned about our ability to compete on a global level if we don't tap into that talent starting today.
Keep going. We got it.
So you and your organizations have been at the forefront of fostering diversity among entrepreneurs in the city. So speaking of the challenges, I wanted to set it up as here's the problem and we recognize it. What do you and your organizations do, if you could describe for the audience how you go about addressing this problem? Also maybe a little bit about what you found to work and things you've tried that you found to not work in terms of driving more diversity into the entrepreneur community. Let's start with Charlie.
So I founded Diversity Fund specifically as a platform to finance diverse entrepreneurs. We're very goal-driven in that we focus on basically startup and business finance for the rest of us. So folks who have been traditionally outside the access to capital, whether it was conventional capital from banks or venture capital or startup capital, that's our mission and that's our focus. We've now seen, a growth in the incubators and accelerators that are starting to diversify and provide platforms for diverse entrepreneurs to learn their skills and to start businesses. But there's still a gigantic gap when it comes to finance. In fact, our first women-led VC just started 2 years ago, and that's the only one in Austin. And their capital is much smaller than the other VCs in town. And so we're really on this mission to take Diversity Fund and spread it nationally and make sure that a diverse set of entrepreneurs can get financing for their businesses.
I kind of come from, I have two worlds. One, I've got a company that I've run for about 15 years, and then I'm in this new startup environment. And it has been really interesting kind of looking at the start of both of these. But one of the things that we made a very conscious effort to do, my partner is an African-American male, was that as we are building the team, that we are being very conscious about what that means with each additional person. And what are the underrepresented groups that we need at the table in order to really, at the end of the day, be able to look back and say we've already got it, as opposed to having more of a reactive response later. So a couple of our developers in India are actually female. We've consciously been looking at people who we would add to our advisory team and making sure that it is as diverse as we are. Also looking at what positions do we want held by which type. Because again, if you are looking at being very proactive, you have to think about it from the very beginning. So I think that has been, we're so mindful of it. That said, I would say we have some really difficult conversations because with diversity comes, there's difference in that, and that means that it's hard. It's hard because you're coming from two very different worlds. We share this line of values, which is interesting to me that we both come back to the same line of values, but we come with different needs and wants. What I have seen over the last 18 months, though, is the product that we have now is so much more robust and makes so much more sense from a utility perspective because we have hashed it out and hashed it out and hashed it out. So I want to acknowledge that because that you're bringing that difference to the table, that that's not the easier road. It is definitely the harder road. But I think the long-term impact creates better economic value for the organization.
Good. Preston, you founded Div Inc. as Diversity Incubator. Why did you do that, and what are you trying to do with it?
What were you thinking?
Yeah, I think I made my transition from corporate into the startup community. First, I became a mentor, then I was an angel investor, and I came in knowing that there were challenges with lack of diversity in the tech startup ecosystem. I didn't realize how severe they were and how little was being done. And to be quite honest, when I became an angel investor, I saw a lot of people were coming to me to pitch. And when people were coming to me to pitch, this is what I started to see. I started to see, wow, white males, the quality of their pitches about their business was here, in general. Not all of them, in general. And then for people of color and women, it was in here. And to me, I was really kind of taken aback by this gap. And I wanted to understand why this gap existed and what we needed to do about it. And so Long story short, what I recognized was that people of color and women, for example, were not participating at, like, say, a co-working space hub, right, in Capital Factory. And I think if anybody in Capital Factory was on this stage, they would admit that they didn't have that population in their co-working space. Now, Capital Factory being the hub of entrepreneurship in 2014, corporations were there, investors were there, workshops were happening, meetups were happening, but people of color and women were not there in large numbers. So cost was one thing, right? But a big thing that kept coming up was, I don't see anybody that looks like me, and I don't feel comfortable, and I don't feel welcome in this environment. And so therefore, by not being there, they were not getting access to these resources that were available, pretty much free, right? And so out of that, discovery, it was like, okay, well, what if we bridge the underrepresented communities to these resources? Because I do have a network on the investor co-working space, that side, and I am also connected to African American, Hispanic, and women. Why don't we bridge that via a accelerated program? So take some of the best that's out there, bring it to early stage founders, and most of those are first-time founders that don't know what they're doing, right? Even though they say they think they know what they're doing, they don't know what they're doing. And really just kind of bring that together. And so saying all of that, that is really, the key piece for us was not just having another program in Austin, but it was creating a space. It was creating a culture, an environment where people of color and women would feel welcome, right? And creating an environment where they can actually thrive, right? And that was really giving them that access. So we're really removing the barriers for entry and for success for them by bridging them to that. And I want to say again, it was not about excluding anyone. It was about making sure that we were including underrepresented groups while bridging them to a group of people who had the desire, genuine desire, to want to do better by diversity and inclusion, but didn't necessarily know how, right? And so you had key leaders in the community were saying, damn, we're trying,
That's right.
but it's not really working, so we can plug into this, and then we can start to collaborate more.
Excellent. Christine, what does your organization do, and what are you driving towards?
So as some of you know in this room, I came out of, so Retail Me Not, the company I just left, has the largest homegrown diversity and inclusion program in town. But you may not even know that because it's recently started to be PR'd, which is very nice. I came out and I'd already been helping other companies with embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations, and realized very quickly that the men and women, primarily women right now, doing this work in the space, didn't know that companies were going around and cherry picking them for the same business, didn't know they were offering them different amounts for the same items, didn't know that some of us were meeting 2-3 times with the same organization. So I pretty much shuttered what I've been doing, and I'm focused on ecosystem building, because this is, if we cannot be inclusive in our own entrepreneurial environment when we're DEI practitioners, then there's something wrong. And so some of us are working towards what I'm loosely calling a collective, which is putting for-profit people together to try to make sure they know one another. We can present a more united front. We all know, if you're in this space, that Austin's 3 to 4 years behind San Francisco. There's a lot of talk and not a lot of walk. Sometimes if you've done this inside of a company, they assume you had a lot of access to capital. That's absolutely not true. It's a very difficult, it's the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm an old, tough bag. So to find out when I get out, even though I knew some of this coming out, because I started in 2016 doing it, and by the way, I did it while I still had a full-time job, which is very common. I ran legal operations. to find out that our own ecosystem wasn't aware of one another and wasn't meeting and building community, and also noticing that the nonprofit world was also having some similar issues was quite sad. So we're working on actually homegrown stuff, and on a macro level, I'm looking at the B-Lab community ecosystem and also companies that are starting to monetize this work at scale to figure out how to plug in practitioners locally.
Excellent. The undertone I'm hearing about the things you all are talking about is that it's not sufficient to just fulfill an ambient need, but there's an opportunity to venture out to attract more diversity into the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Any thoughts about how we might do that more? Oh, Charlie?
Well, one of the things I purposely do is try to be intersectional. So I'll attend events and meetings with different groups, and then I'll try to carry some of that message back to guys who look like me, particularly, because I'll hear somebody say, well, gosh, we wish we could hire women in technology. And I'll say, well, do you ever go to the women at technology events? Do you know that there's lesbians who might have 100 people show up at their meetings here in Austin? And they'll go like, what? Never heard of them. Or somebody will say, we're trying to find executives and we want to diversify our workforce. It's like, well, don't you know there's a Black MBA association here in town, and there's Latinitas, and there's so many different groups,
Yeah.
but like you said, they're not all plugged in, they're not connected together.
Correct.
And the groups that are basically on top are totally unaware of these other groups.
Yes, and frankly, I am much more comfortable in the startup community because I think that the millennial, post-millennials that are coming out and creating organizations now already know these things. They're already speaking the language. They already understand the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think you have to make a real, if you're in school right now and you're coming out, you have to really decide when you're picking if you want to be employed rather than be self-employed, that the place you're going to isn't just talking about this, they're actually doing something about it. And once you're inside, you'll find your community because we had over 360 people in the program I just left. It was very robust. It's still very active in the community. Once you build grassroots inside an organization that you think is walking the talk enough for you, you can find your space. But if you're creating your own space self-employed, we have a wealth and depth of bench of resources in Austin that I think are wonderful. And if anyone wants to email me at Christine@ImpactDEI, I'll send you a list of resources. I keep a scary list of resources. But tell me what your specific concern is, and I'll send you. Because we really don't have right now a central repository even for all of that.
I'll ping you and we'll...
It's your email. I'm
we'll-
like, okay, I need it.
We'll
It's a
connect
central
it to the
repository
Herb
now.
Kelleher Center resources page, where a lot of our students go to find out about resources in town and on campus.
Yeah, and some people tease me that I'm like a human Rolodex. I go to almost everything, to your point, because understanding different intersections is wonderful.
So, Blanca?
I think it's interesting to look at it from the perspective of, I'm not a white person, but it's interesting to look at what the responsibility is for someone who is a person of color or an underrepresented group. And, I recently was trying to endeavor into the fundraising space for my organization. And it was very challenging to tap into a group that I am not part of, right? And so we can get stuck in the mindset of, oh, it's hard, woe is me kind of thing. There's only 1% of VC is going to come to me because I'm brown and female, so it's horrible, right? Like we can get into that mindset, and you just got to say, suck it up, buttercup, figure it out, right? And I think it was really interesting to me because one of my friends, she told me, why aren't you talking to a mutual friend of ours, he's active in the VC community. And I'm like, oh, it's kind of weird. And he was like, he will help you. He'll advocate for you. And it was really interesting to be able to meet with him and then to put on the table, this is awkward for me because I know that you are helping me because I don't have access. But I literally put that on the conversation table. And I think that is our responsibility. I do think there are a lot of men in the VC world who, Charlie's here, who really do want to be helpful, but we have to engage in that conversation as well. So I don't think it can be, let's wait for the resources to present. I think we need to start taking an active role in finding who are those advocates in the community, because they're there. They may not know how to find us, but what if we said we want to be proactive and find them? It's not that many points of separation. I just think it's going to take some real effort on our community side as well to be a little more bold in the ask and not assume that it's going to be declined, because we just need to get in front of them. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more of that from underrepresented groups.
Yeah, I see it as it's definitely two-way, right? And so I was sitting on a panel yesterday, and we've heard this terminology before about getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Yeah. You guys have heard that before, right? Be comfortable being uncomfortable. Because in a nutshell, we all have to come out of our zones and our networks in order to bridge networks, right? In order to collaborate, we really have to step outside. And it's funny, you were talking about, people can't, find each other. I mean, I've had somebody say, well, who is the leader of the Black Chamber? And I'm like, you gotta be kidding, right? I mean, so to me, it's off the top of my head, right? But for somebody who might be in the accelerated VC community and the leader been here a number of years, they don't know somebody who's just on the other side of the highway, right? And that's because their network is such that they're just not connected that way, right? And that's not necessarily, you could say it's that person's fault, but the reality is that's their network. And what I've grown to understand and respect is that we're all very, very busy in our very, very important roles, right? And so when you look at your day and how 12 hours just go by, that's your day. And it takes a big extra effort to go and say, okay, I'm going to get up and I'm going to go to this meeting with, it's like, say for me, I'm going to go to this meeting with the Hispanic Chamber or the Latinitas in technology, knowing that I'm probably going to be the only one African-American male there, right? And so one thing that really impresses me with the folks that are sitting up here is that they are not afraid to step out and be present. Now, granted, you might be the first of the only person in there, but the next time you go, bring somebody with you, right? And then you continue, and then it has to go both ways. And so I commend, Charlie is one of the first guys Charlie shows up. Charlie does not mind being the only white guy in the room full of Black people or, people of color. Charlie will be there. And I think that shows the authenticity of that individual right out the gate, right? For somebody to be there.
I think I would add too, I came from Washington, D.C., so for me to come here, it felt backwards. And so I felt uncomfortable. Some of us feel more comfortable in environments where we may look odd here, but to me, I feel more comfortable in those environments. Yeah. I had a speaking engagement last week at Austin Country Club, and I had to suspend my own bias. One of the people that was there, and we had a good chuckle together, is here, because I don't feel comfortable going there. I left DC where I was and my first husband because I wanted to be away from that sort of lifestyle. So it's nice to not even assume. Sometimes I'm more comfortable sitting with you, Preston, than I was sitting initially in Austin Country Club. So it's interesting, isn't it? How we have to look at one another. I'm constantly needing to meet people with compassion. I'm very disturbed about going out in public right now because I'm so triggered by what's going on. But I know that my Black, brown, and all friends of color are triggered more than me. So if they can step out, I'm going to step out, frankly, even more than I normally do right now. So I'm quite active in social media because of that. Because we're not going to be afraid. Yeah. We're going to keep having this conversation because this conversation, the future's already happening now.
And I think you learn so much from both sides. To your point, and I'm going to cut this short. When I joined Central Texas Angel Network here, which is one of the largest angel networks in the United States. And at the time, it was 125 members, angel investors. And when I first showed up, I was like the only African American in the room with angel investors, so high net worth people, right? And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing up in this room. I got a little bit of money, but I ain't got this kind of money. And the language they were talking was very intimidating for me, right? But just as I'm sitting here trying to be as cool as I can be, I was trying to be cool in that room as well. But I learned from them, and then they learned from me. And as a result, our friendship and our partnership expands over a 4-year period. And now I can tap into that network as a result of what I do. So we have to be there, we have to be present, we have to engage with each other. So step out, challenge yourself and step out there.
Just like good entrepreneurs, you've started my transition into the other perspective, which is, you've been generous with the experience, and a lot of what you do is about mentoring founders. And I'd like to draw on that experience and that intent to discuss how women and other underrepresented entrepreneurs among our students and among other guests can increase their odds of success of the entrepreneurial ventures, i.e. how can they navigate an ecosystem as someone who's an underrepresented founder. You spoke a little bit about networking, and you highlighted with, for example, C10 person, there's a general tendency among networks to be more homogeneous, right? So just look at your Facebook friends.
Right.
It tends to be highly identity-centric on average. How can an underrepresented founder go about breaking into important networks within their industry or the technology space and within the entrepreneurial ecosystem? I'll start with Charlie. Some thoughts?
It's a challenge. I read a lot of the literatures out there about some of the challenges, particularly, say, women have. And they go to women entrepreneurial or support groups. But often they're looking for a male mentor, to provide introductions or something like that. I'm mentoring right now to a physician out of New York who's got a medical startup company, and she reached out to me. She's a surgeon. She's Vietnamese, first generation American. She also happens to be a lesbian. And she reached out to Diversity Fund because she couldn't find any place else where she felt she fit in. So she was looking for a mentor, even though I'm not lesbian and I'm not Vietnamese and I'm certainly not a surgeon. But that was like one of the first things in our first conversation was she's like, I want to understand this other part of the world where I've never been. I don't know the white male startup VC world. So, I need a mentor who can help explain and help open the doors to that community as well.
Any other? Blanca?
I think as far as networking is concerned, I think you've got to find the person that you're most, how should I say, because of this uncomfortable idea, right? Go to the person that's on the fringe of comfort for you and ask them to help you out. I just think that's really the critical step. And I also think it's really important as you start up your own organizations to not diminish the small choices that you will make early on that could have a big impact in your organization to really promote diversity and inclusion. I was mentoring a student a couple of weeks ago here at the university, and we're chatting. He's developing this app. It's him and another male founder. The two guys are white guys. And I just said kind of off the cuff, I was like, hey, by the way, your next hire, can you make them a female? And he was like, oh, yeah. And I was like, really? And I just kind of said it kind of tongue-in-cheek, but kind of hoping he'd hear a little bit. But it was like he had not really thought about it, but he was not close to that idea. And so think about those little things that you could do within our environment here in Austin locally within your organization. It doesn't have to be some big, massive initiative on we're going to start a new networking whatever for this particular segment. I don't think you need to do all of that. I think it's very small incremental changes that you can do in the immediate that really can help you kind of start stepping out of your box.
I think it's important to know whether you're looking for a mentor, an ally, or a sponsor or a coach. If you are, so mentoring, I've done all of these things. And a sponsor is typically someone who's not in the room with you, but is helping you if you want to be promoted, is speaking on your behalf. An ally is showing up, is becoming engaged and active, understanding the conversation, being supportive. A coach is really giving you tactical advice on how to proceed. And a mentor, you're really doing most of the work. You're showing up with the issue. The mentor is facilitating you in ways that you may not have otherwise have access to. But before you do any of that, you kind of need to know in which situation you're looking for what. And you need to know what your personal story is. What is it that's motivating you before you go out and articulate what it is. So many people don't know why they're doing things, and they go out and just start doing stuff. And you really can kind of smell it when you already don't have much time and you're spending so much time literally taking every meeting, which I'm sure most of us do because we care to a fault. It's really helpful if you already know your story, can articulate in 2 or 3 sentences what's driving you, where you're trying to go, and what sort of a relationship you're looking for. I see heads nodding for people who do professional mentoring, and I think that's important to think about.
Speaking of people who are doing mentoring, from your mentoring experience, what mistakes have you seen women and other underrepresented founders make that can prevent them from achieving the full potential of their businesses?
Can I answer that really quick?
Go.
I always say this, and some of you already know this, but I am 54, and I am telling you, my 40s and 30s and 20s were particularly rough. The 50s are so fabulous. If I had liked myself and been this confident, because I was doing a lot of false bravado in the 20s and 30s and naughty things and all kinds of stuff. When you find your power because you know you're living in your true purpose, and I think a lot more of the generations now do that, you have to make sure you access it and deploy it effectively and quickly so that you move faster than I just did. Because it is pure magic when you're living in your true space and helping people in ways that you never knew you could.
Blanca?
I would say of mistakes, I'm first gen here. And for those of you that are first gen, you may relate to having kind of this mentality of surviving. And I think when I started my first organization, the lens of which I ran that organization was just getting to the next milestone, what is just right in front of me so that we don't die, choke off, get closed, the IRS comes, whatever. And I think that in hindsight, I wish somebody had told me to not operate surviving, but to operate from a mentality of success. So I think for entrepreneurs, what I would say is try to have that mental shift that you've already survived, you're here, we're okay, you've eaten, it's good. That's surviving. But really the ability to do something far greater than your wildest dreams is really what's at hand for entrepreneurs. So I would say allow yourself to have that as where you're going as opposed to like this more limited goal. Because I definitely can see in that first organization that was built into the DNA of that organization and it moved very slow. And that was really a reflection of me leading it that way. So I would encourage you to think much, much bigger.
Let me ask this question. How many of you have engaged with a mentor who didn't do anything for you? By show of hands. They didn't do anything for you. Okay. I was in that boat too, and I would get like, you know what, that person was a waste of my time. And as I got older, what I realized was that it wasn't necessarily their fault. It was my fault. Why? Because I didn't tell them what it is that I wanted or needed, right? To a point. I didn't tell them what I wanted and needed. I wasn't clear. I wasn't concise about how they can help me, right? And think about it. If you say to somebody, how can I help you? And they go blah, 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 blah. You're like, okay, great. We'll see you next time. And next time never happens. It really falls back on the individual. And so the ability to really come to the table with a clear, concise, some self-awareness about who you are, where you're trying to go, what you're trying to do, what you need help with specifically. Now, the challenge that I have with that, and many people, and we've heard this in conversations with entrepreneurs and also corporate, oftentimes for people of color, underrepresented demographics, and women, to be that vulnerable and ask for help is difficult. Because we've been brought up to be, I got this, I'm in control, I got it. We don't want to show weakness. And so I got burned by that. I actually got burned by that. I came in, I was suited down, ready to go, and I was just talking big game. And what somebody came back and told me was like, man, we love you. You have tremendous street credibility within the corporate environment. Everybody loves you. Everybody thinks you're doing great. But what you just demonstrated was a lack of self-awareness. And I was like, what? And it wasn't the fact that I wasn't self-aware. I wouldn't let myself be vulnerable. And I didn't know how to ask for help, right? Because I thought asking for help was a sign of weakness. And I couldn't give them that benefit. So we do have to allow ourselves to learn how to be vulnerable, be self-aware, and also ask for help in a very clear and concise manner. And then you will see people begin to do for you. And then when you're not in the room, they will be the ones speaking on your behalf.
All right. My last question before I open it up for questions from the audience. Let's make some predictions here. So let's assume that entrepreneurs take your advice and that your organizations do what they want to do. Given current trends, let's say 10 years from now, what do you expect to see in terms of representation, and how do you expect a conversation on diversity and entrepreneurship to be different?
Start or should Charlie start?
No, go ahead, please.
I get so excited. I want to get to the part where we're all talking to each other. So I think the conversation is going to shift within 5 years. We know that in 2016, millennials became the largest workforce, and I really identify with how millennials are going about their lives. We know that by 2025, millennials and post-millennials will be 75% of the workforce. We know that 42% of millennials are multicultural, multi-ethnic, Hispanic, Hispanic, I don't know, we're not going to get into the semantics right now. African American and Asian American, we know that they care about social impact. If you look at my site, and I'm not saying this because of my site, but it's because this Venn diagram means so much to me. Economic value and social value, the center sits diversity, equity, and inclusion, or sustainability, or whatever it is that you think is going to help improve our world. These two things are going to marry, and those generations are not going to go forward without purpose-led or mission-driven organizations that really speak to their team members and customers. And I think that's going to happen in the next 5 years. Part of this, you have to look at two good things that are happening with this scary environment we're in right now. Number one is it's given me even deeper empathy and compassion for my friends of color, because I am so triggered and feel so unsafe going around in the United States right now as a woman. Number two, I think that there are a lot of men in power. I know this because I am compassionate and meet with a lot of senior gentlemen who are trying to retire early or looking to move out now. They're starting to realize these sort of seismic things make them start to realize faster than they have been, you either need to adapt to where we're going or move on. And so I think in the next 5 years, it's going to start to change as we see other folks get into power, and we know this strong undercurrent of entrepreneurship that's going on, and it's often led by typically considered minorities, the new majority, that we're going to see this starting to change in the next 5 years. I'm really excited. Don't get depressed. Keep
Charlie?
going.
Oh, well, all I can say is down with the patriarchy.
Wow, I love your optimism. I don't know that I feel quite that optimistic. So 10 years out, I think there's going to be a gap. I think there's going to be a gap between services that actually are targeted towards the other group or the new majority, whatever we want to call it. I think there's going to be a gap. And from a business perspective, I see that as business opportunity, like, let's go. So how do we position ourselves for that? I'd love to think that boardrooms will change in a decade. I don't think that's the case. I think that if we can get a third, of more diverse people in boardrooms, then we will see that affect large corporations. And I'm hopeful. I think it's going to be my grandchildren's.
Do you think we'll still have, do you think this structure of large corporations is not going to start? This is just untenable, the way we're going about it.
Yeah, but we've been here for so long, so I don't know that it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be that quick of a switch. There's too many of those people in power that will remain there for another decade. So I don't think we're going to see a shift that quickly. I hope I'm wrong.
Maybe I'll ask a specific question, Charlie. How long before women get 30% of VC funding?
If you look, if I put my analytical hat on and I look at trends, I would say it's going to be a long time, unless we can totally upset the current system. But there are many people, whether it's the Occupy movement or whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's the stuff going on this week in Washington, there are plenty of people waking up and ready to overthrow the current system in some way, in some manner, and cause a radical shift. So I'm more optimistic for change personally because I'm involved in it, and I put aside the trends themselves.
How many, one of the most effective things I've found with my male allies, sorry, I just want to say this one last thing, is that I often will say to them, if you had the career I did and have run and founded and done as many things as I have, if I had, I'd be an angel investor by now. The amount of times I have helped lovely men, not in Washington, there were often disturbing people I helped there, but here I've had a really good experience. But they have moved 3, 4, 5 levels ahead of me when I had much more experience typically. And when I remind them of this, because they care about me genuinely and I genuinely care about them, that's such a motivator for them to be like, oh, I need to really show up as an ally in a real and meaningful way. And it's not embarrassing to say these things. I have no shame about talking about things that might move the needle. And so I'm consistently optimistic because if I had been depressed or had stopped moving, we wouldn't have done as much as we've all done in just the last few years. And that's only been 2 years. And we realize we've probably been doing it our whole lives. There's now names for it.
Yeah. It's interesting for me. We used to say, in 10 years, we hope there would be no need for Div Inc. Right? Div Inc. can go away because we have all this diversity. It's just, inclusive and it's all that. If that doesn't happen and Div Inc. is still here, I do believe, and I believe this for a very, very long time, despite how young I am. I believe this since I was a teenager, right? I believe that women are going to lead the way. And I don't say that to knock men down, right? And I don't say that because we are just in this little, a lot of things have been happening with regards to Me Too movement and everything else. I firmly believe because of the leadership styles and how women think in general, and how they run their companies, how they manage their families, how they manage money, that women are going to lead us to this point of where things are going to be a lot more inclusive by the nature of their leadership styles. And I think the world will end up being a much better place because of that leadership. I do have concerns that there may be certain demographic groups that may get left behind because of technology. Because you all know that technology is an enabler, but technology is also a divider. And if we don't close these gaps, then we're going to have large groups, large demographic groups that are left behind, and that's going to be detrimental to us as a nation. And so in 10 years, I really think we'll see a lot more women in positions of leadership across the landscape, political, social, and entrepreneur business perspective. And then I also, I think that's about it. So I think that's the general direction. And my hope is too that we'll have a lot more showcase companies. When I say showcase companies, maybe the next Googles and the Facebooks will have a person of color who was the founder. And I can think of companies right now that many of you have not heard of that I think will be there within that 10 years. And if I named them today, you'd be like, oh, that old guy Preston mentioned this company, 10 years ago. Listener, L-I-S-N-R, Blavity, right? I got a couple coming out of DeVink, Redenim, Lamik, L-A-M-I-K, right? And you'll have, Revealix is another one. Keep an eye on that one. Confirm X, Blanca's there, so watch that one.
I was waiting for
But
you to say
there are
it, 'cause
so many
I'll add it to that.
companies that are out there that we haven't yet heard of that are really doing some amazing things. And I think as we get those showcase companies where people of color are actually the founders and have built these successful, we're going to see an acceleration from those demographic groups. That's my hope over the next 10 years.
Outstanding. We have some time for questions. Any questions for anybody? Just say whom you are directing them to and then ask.
I think it's a Harvard study that talks about how it's not enough to have one woman on the board, you need two. So it'd be lovely if we saw more than one woman put on a board at a time. I've seen women with more experience than some of the other directors on boards who, when it was just one, not be able to have the voice that they needed at the table. So I think that's really important. Do I think a mandate is a problem? I love it that California did that because it at least gets the issue out there in a meaningful way that can be measured and a conversation will ensue. Whether or not that's the right way, ultimately, who knows? But we all know the data on how long it's going to take otherwise unless we move this needle. So I know I sound Pollyanna about overall, but I do believe that the folks coming up are going to look for purpose-driven organizations or create them themselves and do it with more than one role if they have to. And so you're not going to consistently keep, my generation was loyal to companies, Gen X is loyal to people, your generation believes in what you believe. And so I think it'll be fun to watch what happens in California, but I do think it'll be interesting if we don't have enough density of bench in terms of the women on boards, particularly people of color. We know that women are often talked to by BCs in terms of operational issues, and men are spoken to in terms of vision. You have to answer the question and reframe it in terms of vision and strategy. Just like we know that women are only applying for jobs if they have all the experience, and men are applying when they have 60%. That's why men are promoted on potential, women are promoted on actual behavior. So everywhere we go, whether you're a woman of color or a white old gal like me, we know that we have these extra steps we have to go through. And we have to have game face on when those things are occurring in the moment and know it's going to happen and reframe and pivot. And that's why I think we make better leaders, because we pivot and are flexible and understand a room and are so hyper vigilant and aware of situations we're in order to navigate the space safely and effectively, that I think we're particularly effective in meetings. So that's a shame, but I think that's still a reality. I have an idea about big companies, which I wish that big companies who are freaking about HB1 visas and other things for software, for technical people, would do a commensurate amount of folks in the non-technical, or what I hate to say, what's called, I hate technical, non-technical, technical versus professional, to sponsor a similar amount of folks in that same group, in that same instance. You don't see that happening with companies, but that would be a matching thing is a really good idea to bring to your own organizations. Why are we putting all of these resources against 20 software engineers? And what about all the professional folks or non-technical folks that we also care about? That's one workaround in terms of corporate. Do you have ideas given your...
Well, I think when we think about kind of what tradition, I don't know if it's maybe stereotypical is a better word, what stereotypical entrepreneurs from other countries, what they're coming here to do, we're seeing dry cleaning, nail salon, service-based businesses. And I don't know that we give enough credit to those very community-centric companies that are they're small. But I think there could be an opportunity in the future to really targeting these small businesses and helping them get to a larger scale. Could they franchise the nail salon? These people who are doing this have an incredible work ethic, again, because they've got this survivor thing that they've got to do, right? And then they're modeling it for their children. So I think they end up being like this incredible work base that is very underserved right now. I think it'd be really interesting to do, a incubator of sorts for this type, for service-based companies, something I've thought about for a long time. Like, what would that look like? How would we really move the needle for immigrants who are really making an economic impact in communities here? So I think there's opportunities there. I don't know.
Yeah.
I like that.
It's really, really interesting that you brought that up. One of the things that I uncovered when we started Div Inc., and we focus on tech startups, right? Tech or tech-enabled companies. But what I had uncovered from the Census Bureau data about small businesses was pretty amazing, right? There was this celebration that the growth rate of African-American owned businesses, Hispanic owned businesses, women owned businesses had increased very, very significantly over a 5-year period. And that the fastest growing segment were African-American women and Latino women. But when I dug down a little bit deeper, what I found out, and I'm just using this as an example, right? There's other data points. Of the 3 million African-American owned businesses, only 4% of those, right, were employers. Y'all heard me on that, right? Only 4% of 3 million African-American owned business were actually employers that actually had employees. So there was 96% of those businesses did not have employees, right? And on the Hispanic owned businesses, it was 9% were employers. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity, especially when you compare that to non-minority owned businesses where they have, 26, 25% of their businesses have employees. There's a tremendous opportunity to do more with those small businesses that have not yet even tried to grow. And you're talking about if you had one of those companies hire one person or two people, the job creation, right, that goes into the millions very, very quickly, right? Similarly, I think on the social impact side, social enterprise side, I think there's a whole movement. I mean, there is a movement, I don't think. There is a movement happening on that side where, people are trying to serve the community better, right? And in a very innovative way. I think the key for me is that I don't want folks to get caught up in, I don't have a tech business. In the next, all businesses for all practical purposes should be leveraging tech, right, to go ahead and grow and scale their business regardless of who they are, right? We got scooters running around town, right? Scooters have been around for what? I don't know. They're older than me. That's all I know, right? And here
But you're
here
very
they are,
young.
mobile app, get on the scooter and ride around town. People are like, a scooter that's not a tech, but they're leveraging tech, and now they're building this crazy business, which is amazing, right? Lawn services, right? There's a couple of companies in town. You go to their mobile app, boom, you get lawn services, blah, 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 grocery shopping, whatever. So I think the innovation piece is really, really key, and I think small business owners need help learning how to grow their business. And I think if we can focus a little bit on that and bring things to parity, man, what difference we can actually make.
Cool. Last question, sorry. Yeah.
Recommendations for what? I'm
How
sorry.
to
What
overcome
was
that.
in the tech space or?
In the job market.
I do have recommendations.
Blacks in Technology is a good resource too, if you're not involved there.
I'm sorry.
Blacks in Technology is so good here.
Yeah, so there are, so there's a couple of things happening. So Be Wise, have you heard of Be Wise? Black Women in Science and Engineering. That's an organization here. They are focused on women in technology, and they're bringing in the entrepreneurship component into that. There's going to be, hopefully, within the next 30 days, another organization called Black Women Talk Tech, which is coming out of New York. And one of their co-founders has moved to Austin, and they're now getting ready to establish chapters across the United States. And we participated in their conference up there in New York, and it was amazing to see the talent and so I think working with those organizations and plugging them into the broader ecosystem where they can tap into a lot of the existing resources that are in Austin. And when I say that, UT, Houston Tillotson, St. Edwards, ACC Community College, plus the accelerator and co-working space environment, there is so much upside here for entrepreneurs like yourself and others. There's some tremendous upside if we can just help you plug in a way that can accelerate what you're trying to do.
Large tech companies
So we
host
could
like
talk more
Anita
about
Board
what
chapters,
that-
and that just, look at an Eventbrite, look at Anita Board, Blacks in Technology, all these other things. You'll start to, and just go to these events. They're free, and
Yeah.
meet people.
We could go on for a while,
We could.
but we have a time limit here. Entrepreneurship thrives with on difference, and the more we have diversity in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, the more the greater the surface area for both opportunity and new ideas will be. I'd like to thank you for the role you play in increasing that diversity, and I'd like to thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.